Hey guys, so sorry for being late again. I'm going through kind of a rough time right now, but I will get back to gaming in the near future. You will see. In the meantime, I just have some other fun stuff to upload. So, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare is the game that brought up the first person shooter genre in contemporary combat back in 2007 and is one of Call of Duty's most successful titles. Modern Warfare 2 did not disappoint, it only increased sales for the game. Modern Warfare 2 was also the game that introduced me to Call of Duty. Yes, I heard of the games before, but I never did pay much attention. It wasn't until I saw Modern Warfare 2, more specifically the mission Wolverines, that I first developed a love for the Modern Warfare series, and then it spread to the other Call of Duty titles. The main reason why I took a liking to the game was because it showed a conventional invasion of the US, one of the tropes that I like in a World War III media scenario. Arguably, this is one of the most iconic scenes in Modern Warfare 2. But smartasses have taken to the debate field of the internet to argue about the feasibility and even possibility of invading the United States. There are people who believe it is utterly impossible to even attack the US in any form. Therefore, they blast the game. But naturally, you can refute their claims. I even made a video on my other channel, but to answer the questions of the comments section, we should delve into the logistics of Russia invading the US East Coast. When you come to think of it, it does raise some questions. The easiest place that Russia can invade the US is through Alaska, and while that does happen in the Modern Warfare series, it also begs the question, how was Russia able to invade the East Coast of the US? Naturally, if Russia wants to invade the East Coast, it has to go through the Atlantic Ocean at some point. The obvious route, which is a transatlantic pass, is quite unlikely, as a direct path would pretty much be blocked. Flying over there would mean that NATO defenses would pick them up, and the Russians would already be at war in Europe. Moving through the Arctic would also prove to be very difficult because of the Guyuk Gap. This is a stretch of ocean that NATO has constant eyes on and began monitoring during the Cold War so that it would be much harder for Soviet vessels or aircraft to make it through. This is the sole reason why Iceland is a part of the alliance. So obviously that route is blocked. But what if they went through the Middle East, then Africa, and then the Atlantic Ocean? That's also not a good idea because it's way too far. Russia has some military bases in the Caucasus and in Syria, but they have none in Africa where they can stop to regroup and refuel. There are plans for Russia to open a military base in Eritrea, but this is only one base, and that country is on the other side. If they had maybe chosen Morocco or some country on the west coast of Africa, they might have a chance, but currently there are no plans to do that. This is where any American nationalist would point to the index finger and say, aha, the East Coast is impossible to invade conventionally. But let me prove them wrong here, as there is a way for Russia to reach the East Coast, and that route goes through South America. But for starters, let's go through the step-by-step process at how Boris Varshevsky was able to get his troops to the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. First of all, let's start with mobilization. By Modern Warfare 2, Russia and the West are already in a new Cold War, so obviously the militaries are much larger than they are today. Russia has about 800,000 regular military personnel and almost 2 million in reserve and paramilitary forces. It might not reach the heights that it was during the Soviet Union when the country had 5 million personnel, but it would definitely be larger. The US is indeed a powerful country, and a small army would definitely not be able to attack it conventionally. But there is a way to further augmentate Russian numbers, and that is to go in with their ally China. China has the largest army in the world, and it's also allied with Russia. For one, in Modern Warfare 2, they do support the Russians because they vote in favor of it at the UN. More proof is that the QBZ-95, which is the Chinese service rifle of the PLA, is in the Modern Warfare series. So you can easily say that China supports their Russian ally in going to war with the West. But this leads us to our next step. Surely a large set of cargo planes couldn't pass through halfway around the world unnoticed. And especially not when you have ships which are also needed to bring up heavy armor and many other equipment. But this is where General Shepard comes in. We know in the game that he wanted Russia to invade the US so he could cement his status as a war hero. That's why he downed a US satellite so that the Russians could copy it and launch a cyber attack on NORAD satellite systems so that Russian troops' movement could be hidden. Obviously, the game infers it. That's how the Russians and Chinese are able to move around unseen. Then we get to the part where a lot of people get wrong.
An invasion of the American homeland would rely on naval power to get the job done. And right off the bat, no nation on Earth, nor any combination of nations, has the firepower and logistical support needed to carry out such an invasion.
This is completely untrue, as multiple nations have large transport capabilities. The standard transport plane of the Russian military is the Antonov AN-22, and let me just note, China has a very similar kind of plane. This large plane is seen in Modern Warfare 2 dropping paratroopers. It has a maximum payload capacity of 80,000 kilograms. With those specifications, it can travel 5,000 kilometers while carrying a maximum capacity payload and can travel up to almost 11,000 kilometers on full fuel, and if it carries a payload of up to 45,000 kilograms. By comparison, the US's standard transport aircraft is the C-130 Hercules. This aircraft has a maximum capacity of 19,000 kilograms, less than a quarter of what the AN-22 has. And it has a smaller range as well, maxing out at 3,800 kilometers. And this is just a standard transport plane. The largest transport plane is the Antonov AN-124, the Ruslan. This aircraft has a capacity of carrying 150,000 kilograms, although it has a much smaller range at only 3,700 kilometers, with a maximum payload. But the point is that Russia and China do have the means of delivering troops to the US. Now, people will say that you can't carry large tanks large distances on cargo aircraft. But if you actually look at the gameplay in Modern Warfare 2, the only thing you see flying down are just Russian paratroopers and Russian light armor. You don't see any heavy armor there, meaning this was a completely airborne operation, and I will get to that later on. Now we get to the next phase, which is the first landing in Latin America. Remember when Brazil denied the US entry to pick up Task Force 141? Well, this also does give a hint in relation to the Call of Duty Battlefield crossover where the Federation is in an alliance with Russia and China. That is why virtually all airfields in the Federation would be open to the Antonovs coming from the Pacific. But regardless of that, Russian and Chinese jets would be able to land on overseas bases in the area. In accordance with their alliance with President Maduro, Russia is landing aircraft in Venezuela, and it is also opening an overseas military base in La Orchita, so it will be right on the US's doorstep. On a similar scale, President Daniel Ortega has also opened up his borders in Nicaragua so that Russian bases will be even closer to the US. Lerd Sigint Station has also been declared as more of a way station than an actual base for Russia in Cuba, but it is a location that is even closer to the US. The status of the station is currently unknown. Official reports say that the place was closed in 2002, but other reports conflict this, stating that it has been reopened and allegedly hosts Chinese intelligence forces as well. If it truly is active, then it would also be an obvious stopping point. After leaving Siberia and China, the planes would land in Latin America to regroup and refuel, and then they would make their pass onto the East Coast. While flying over the Atlantic, they would fly at low altitudes to avoid being detected by radar. In 1976, when Palestine terrorists hijacked an Air France plane and landed it at Entebbe in Uganda, they demanded the release of several Palestinian prisoners. The Israeli Defense Force came up with a plan to rescue them, so they had to fly all the way to Uganda. In order to reach Uganda, the Israeli government requested the government of Kenya if they could land at their airfield, which indeed was granted. But the Israelis still had to cross the Middle East to reach the Indian Ocean, something that its Islamic neighbors would not allow. And so, Israeli C-130 Hercules planes flew at a low altitude of only 100 meters so that radar couldn't detect them. The Russians and the Chinese would do the same. And if you look at the skies in the mission Wolverines, you can see that they are flying at low altitudes. Now that they might be seen off the coast by ships it will then be too late by that point because they can just make a quick pass all the way then to the East Coast. The first phase is to drop paratroopers to act as shock troops and secure certain areas for further reinforcements. Like I said, yes, it's going to be very difficult to actually get the whole Russian Navy and maybe even the Chinese Navy to the East Coast completely undetected, but airborne units could make this a feasible operation. This is easily confirmed as in Modern Warfare 2, you only see Russian troops arriving in by parachute, and it is clear that they weren't carrying heavy loads because they are only supported by fighter jets and light armor. You don't see any tanks in Modern Warfare 2, like I said. Their focus was to keep the US and its allies long occupied to buy time for the Russian Navy to come in, and the Navy could have gone through the Panama Canal, which is probably no longer controlled by the US at that point, especially after their equipment failed when the EMP blanketed the US East Coast. And if you think that maybe this wouldn't achieve anything strategic-wise, well, that's actually wrong. The whole purpose of the fight was a response to the massacre at Zakhaev Airport, where Makarov framed the US. And the only point the Russians invaded was to get revenge by killing American citizens. Ghost even confirms the whole point of the invasion was a blood-for-blood brawl.
The Russians ain't gonna let this massacre go unanswered. It's gonna get bloody.
Too right, mate. Now in the eyes of the world, they're the victims. No one's gonna say a word when the Russians club every American they can reach.
I know this is basically a war crime, but look, it happens during a lot of wars. I guess the old term says it, war never changes. And so that's the process of the war. Russia and China copy the ACS model and start off with a cyber attack. They fly to and refuel in South America before finally reaching the US, where their job is to kill as many Americans as possible before the Russian Navy arrives to extract them out. I guess this explanation shows that Call of Duty has more realism than you might think. It is really in the tune with the Battlefield series. And yeah, you all know how I like to put those two together.